always thought RV parks were supposed to be these peaceful places where families gather around campfires and retirees live out their golden years in comfort. You know, the kind of spots you see in travel brochures with smiling people in lawn chairs watching sunsets. That was before I started hearing these stories, before I realized that some RV parks hide secrets that would make your blood run cold. What I'm about to share with you happened to real people in real places. These aren't urban legends or campfire tales passed down through generations. These are 3 documented incidents that took place at RV parks across the country, each one more disturbing than the last. By the end of this video, you'll understand why some travelers now avoid certain parks entirely, and why others have completely given up the RV lifestyle altogether. The first story comes from northern Montana, where a retired couple's dream vacation turned into a nightmare that still haunts them today. The second involves a family of 4 who discovered that their neighbors at a seemingly quiet park in Arizona weren't quite what they appeared to be. And the third story, well, that one happened at a park in Oregon, where guests started disappearing without explanation. I've spent weeks verifying these accounts, speaking with witnesses, and even visiting some of these locations myself. What I found was evidence that these incidents were just the tip of the iceberg. There's a darker side to RV culture that most people never see, and today we're pulling back the curtain on that world. So settle in, because what you're about to hear will change how you think about those quiet little communities on wheels forever. The first incident happened in August of last year at Pine Ridge RV Resort, about 40 miles outside of Kalispell, Montana. Margaret and Frank Torres had been planning this trip for months. They'd just purchased their first RV, a 30-foot Class A motorhome, and Pine Ridge was supposed to be their maiden voyage into retirement travel. The park itself looked perfect in the online photos. Nestled against a backdrop of pine trees with mountain views in the distance, it advertised itself as a quiet retreat for mature travelers. The reviews were mostly positive, though Margaret later told me she wished she'd paid more attention to the few negative ones that mentioned feeling watched and uncomfortable. They arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late August. The heat was oppressive, even for Montana, and they were grateful to find their assigned spot had decent shade from the surrounding trees. The park manager, a thin man in his 60s named Dale, helped them get set up and seemed friendly enough, though Margaret noticed he kept glancing at their expensive RV with an expression she couldn't quite read. Their spot was number 17, positioned at the end of a row that backed up against thick woods. The nearest neighbors were about 50 feet away on either side, close enough to be neighborly but far enough for privacy. Or so they thought. That first night passed without incident. They grilled burgers on their new outdoor setup, watched the sunset from their fold-out chairs, and went to bed feeling like they'd made the right choice about this whole RV lifestyle thing. It was Frank who first noticed something was off. He woke up around 3 in the morning to use the bathroom and happened to glance out the small window above their bed. That's when he saw the figure standing at the edge of the tree line, maybe 30 feet from their RV. It was dark, but the moon was bright enough that he could make out the silhouette of a person just standing there, perfectly still, facing their motorhome. Frank watched for several minutes, thinking maybe it was another camper who couldn't sleep and had stepped outside for some air. But the figure never moved, never shifted position, just stood there like a statue. Eventually, Frank convinced himself he was seeing things and went back to sleep, though it took him a while to drift off. The next morning, he mentioned it to Margaret over coffee, but she laughed it off, suggesting he'd probably seen a tree stump or maybe a deer. The park was surrounded by wilderness, after all. Wild animals wandering close to the campsites wouldn't be unusual. But that second night, Margaret saw it too. She'd gotten up around 2:30 to get a glass of water when movement outside caught her eye. This time, the figure wasn't at the tree line. It was much closer maybe 15 feet from their RV, standing near their picnic table. Margaret grabbed Frank's shoulder and shook him awake, whispering urgently for him to look outside. They both peered through the blinds and saw what was unmistakably a person, average height, wearing what looked like dark clothing, standing motionless beside their outdoor furniture. The person's face was turned toward their RV, though it was too dark to make out any features. Frank wanted to go outside and confront whoever it was, but Margaret held him back. Something about the way the figure stood, so perfectly still, so focused on their RV, made her skin crawl. They watched for nearly 20 minutes before the figure finally turned and walked slowly back toward the woods, disappearing into the darkness between the trees. The next morning, they approached Dale about what they'd seen. He listened to their story with a concerned expression, nodding at all the right moments, but his response was dismissive. He suggested they might have seen another camper who'd gotten confused about which site was theirs, or maybe someone walking their dog. When Frank pointed out that the figure hadn't had a dog and had been standing there for extended periods, Dale just shrugged and said he'd keep an eye out. That afternoon, Margaret decided to walk around the park and introduce herself to their neighbors. She was hoping to find out if anyone else had noticed anything unusual, but what she discovered instead made her even more uneasy. The RV to their left, spot 16, appeared to be occupied. There were lawn chairs set up outside, a welcome mat by the door, and curtains in the windows. But when Margaret knocked, no one answered. She tried several times throughout the day, but the RV remained silent and still, even though there were clear signs that someone was living there. The RV to their right, spot 18, was a different story. An elderly woman named Ruth answered the door and seemed eager to chat, but when Margaret mentioned seeing someone standing near their RV at night, Ruth's demeanor changed completely. Her face went pale, and she glanced nervously toward the woods before quickly excusing herself and shutting the door. That evening, Margaret and Frank made a decision. They set up Frank's old hunting camera, the kind with night vision and motion detection, and aimed it toward the area where they'd seen the figure. If someone was lurking around their campsite, they were going to get proof. The camera worked perfectly. When they checked it the next morning, they found dozens of images from throughout the night. What they saw in those photos made them pack up their RV and leave Pine Ridge that same day, despite having paid for a full week. The images showed the same figure they'd seen, but the night vision revealed details that made their blood run cold. The person wasn't just standing near their RV. In some photos, they were pressed against the windows, hands cupped around their face as they peered inside. Other images showed them trying the door handle, testing whether it was locked, but the most disturbing photos were taken around 4 in the morning. The figure was no longer alone. There were 3 people now, all standing in a circle around Frank and Margaret's RV, all facing inward toward the vehicle, all perfectly still like they were performing some kind of ritual. Margaret showed me those photos when I interviewed her 3 months later. Even in broad daylight, sitting in her living room back in Colorado, those images made me feel sick to my stomach. The night vision gave everything an eerie green glow, but you could clearly see the faces of the 3 figures. They weren't wearing masks or trying to hide their identities. They were just ordinary-looking people, middle-aged, the kind you might pass in a grocery store without a second glance. But the way they stood there, so coordinated, so purposeful, was deeply unsettling. Frank told me he immediately went to Dale's office that morning to show him the photos, but Dale wasn't there. The woman at the front desk, who introduced herself as Dale's wife, looked at the images with what Frank described as mild annoyance rather than shock or concern. She said Dale was out of town unexpectedly and wouldn't be back for several days. When Frank pressed her about what they should do, she simply suggested they might be more comfortable at a different park. That's when Margaret noticed something that made her insist they leave immediately. While Frank was talking to Dale's wife, Margaret had been looking at a bulletin board covered with photos of park events and activities. Mixed in with pictures of barbecues and holiday celebrations were several photos that showed their RV in the background. Not photos where their RV just happened to be visible, but photos that seemed deliberately composed to include their specific campsite. Some of these photos were dated from before they'd even arrived at the park. They packed up in under 2 hours, which is almost impossible for a 30-foot motorhome if you're doing it properly. Margaret said they just threw everything inside, secured what they could, and got out of there. As they were pulling away, she noticed that the RV in spot 16, the one that had appeared empty but occupied, now had people sitting outside. They were watching Frank and Margaret leave, and one of them was taking pictures. The Torres never reported the incident to local police. Frank said he felt foolish, like they didn't have enough evidence that an actual crime had been committed. People standing near your RV isn't technically illegal, and he was worried the police would think they were just paranoid retirees. It's a decision he regrets now, especially after what happened to the family in Arizona just 2 months later. That second incident took place at Desert Winds RV Park outside of Tucson. The Hendricks family, 2 parents and their teenage daughters, had booked a week-long stay during their Christmas vacation. Unlike Pine Ridge, Desert Winds was a larger operation, with over 100 sites and amenities like a pool, clubhouse, and organized activities. It seemed like the kind of place where a family could relax and have fun together. The Hendricks were assigned to Site 43, positioned in what the park called their family section. The sites were closer together here, designed to encourage interaction between families with children. Their neighbors seemed normal enough at first glance. To their right was a couple in their 40s with twin boys around 10 years old. To their left was what appeared to be a multi-generational family: grandparents, parents, and several children ranging from toddlers to teenagers. Sarah Hendricks, the mother, told me she initially felt relieved to be surrounded by other families. After reading online horror stories about RV parks, she'd been worried about staying somewhere that might not be safe for her daughters. The presence of other children and what seemed like normal family activities put her at ease. But by the second day, she started noticing things that didn't quite add up. The twin boys next door never seemed to play or make noise the way children typically do. They would sit outside their RV for hours, just staring at the other campsites, occasionally whispering to each other but never laughing or running around. When Sarah's daughters tried to approach them to say hello, the boys would immediately get up and go inside their RV without saying a word. The family on the other side was even stranger. Despite having several children of various ages, Sarah never heard them talking or playing. The kids would appear outside at specific times, always dressed identically in clean, pressed clothing, and would perform what looked like chores around their campsite. Sweeping, wiping down their picnic table, organizing items that were already perfectly organized. They moved with a mechanical precision that made Sarah's skin crawl. It was her older daughter, Jessica, who first pointed out that none of the children in their section ever seemed to interact with each other. In a normal campground, kids would naturally gravitate toward other kids, forming impromptu friendships and games. But here, each family's children stayed strictly within their own campsite boundaries, as if there were invisible barriers they couldn't cross. On their third night, Sarah's younger daughter, Emma, woke up crying from a nightmare. She'd dreamed that children were standing outside their RV, watching them sleep. Sarah comforted her and looked out the window to prove that no one was there. But what she saw made her question her own sanity. All of the children from the neighboring sites were indeed outside. Not just a few of them, but every single child she'd seen over the past few days. They were arranged in a perfect line extending from one end of the family section to the other, all facing the Hendricks RV. The twins, the identically dressed kids from the other side, and the children from sites she hadn't even realized were occupied. Maybe 20 kids in total, ranging in age from what looked like 5 years old to late teens. They weren't moving or making any noise. They were just standing there in the moonlight, staring at her family's RV with an intensity that made Sarah's hand shake as she held the curtain back. She watched for several minutes, hoping they would disperse or that she would realize she was still dreaming, but they remained motionless. Sarah woke her husband David, who initially thought she was overreacting until he saw the scene for himself. His first instinct was to go outside and demand to know what was going on, but something about the eerie stillness of the children made him hesitate. Instead, he grabbed his phone to record what they were seeing, thinking they might need evidence later. But as soon as he pointed his phone toward the window, the children began to move. Not scattering like normal kids who'd been caught doing something they shouldn't, but turning in perfect unison and walking back to their respective RVs in a coordinated formation that looked almost military in its precision. The next morning, David approached the parents of the twin boys to ask about what they'd witnessed. The father, a soft-spoken man who introduced himself as Michael, listened to David's account with what seemed like genuine confusion. He claimed his boys had been asleep all night, and suggested that David might have seen reflections or shadows that his mind had interpreted as children. When David mentioned that he'd seen kids from multiple campsites, Michael's expression changed. He became defensive, almost aggressive, insisting that David was mistaken and that accusing people's children of disturbing behavior was a serious matter. The conversation ended abruptly when Michael said they should probably keep their families separate for the remainder of their stays. That afternoon, while David was at the park office trying to get answers from the management, Sarah noticed something that made her insist they leave immediately. She was doing laundry at the park's facilities when she overheard a conversation between two women she'd assumed were other campers. They were discussing the Hendricks family in detail, mentioning things like Jessica's college plans and Emma's fear of spiders, information that Sarah was certain she'd never shared with anyone at the park. When she looked around to see who was talking, she realized the women weren't doing laundry at all. They were just standing there, watching her, and when they noticed her listening, they smiled in a way that made Sarah feel like prey being sized up by predators. She hurried back to their RV and found David packing up their belongings. He'd had his own disturbing encounter at the office. The manager, a woman named Carol, had been overly interested in their family details, asking questions that seemed inappropriate for someone running a campground. She wanted to know their home address, their work schedules, even details about their daughter's school activities. When David asked about the strange behavior they'd witnessed from the children, Carol's demeanor shifted completely. She became cold and defensive, suggesting that maybe the Hendricks family wasn't a good fit for Desert Winds. She offered to refund their remaining nights, but only if they left before evening. The family packed up and drove away that same afternoon, but their ordeal wasn't over. For weeks after returning home, they received anonymous letters addressed to their house. The letters contained photos of their RV taken during their stay at Desert Winds, along with detailed information about their daily routines. Someone had been watching them much more closely than they'd realized. The letters eventually stopped, but Jessica still has nightmares about those children standing in perfect formation outside their RV. Emma refuses to go camping at all now, and Sarah checks the locks on their house multiple times every night before bed. The third incident happened just 6 months ago at Whispering Pines RV Resort in southern Oregon. This case is different from the others because it involves actual disappearances. And despite an ongoing investigation, authorities still have no explanation for what happened there. Whispering Pines marketed itself as an upscale destination for RV enthusiasts, with amenities like a spa, gourmet restaurant, and guided nature walks. The park sat on 200 acres of pristine forest land, isolated enough to feel like a wilderness retreat, but still accessible by major highways. It was exactly the kind of place that attracted wealthy retirees looking to spend their golden years exploring the country in luxury. The first person to go missing was Robert Chen, a 72-year-old retired engineer from California. He'd been staying at the park for 3 weeks, planning to continue north to Washington State. Robert was methodical about everything. The type of person who kept detailed travel logs and always informed the park office of his daily plans. On a Tuesday morning in March, Robert told the front desk he was going for a hike on the park's nature trail and expected to be back by afternoon. The trail was well marked and considered safe for people of all fitness levels. When Robert hadn't returned by evening, park staff organized a search party. They found his hiking gear about 2 miles into the trail, neatly arranged beside a fallen log, as if he'd stopped for a rest. His water bottle was still half full, his trail map folded precisely, and his walking stick leaned against the log at a perfect angle. But Robert himself was nowhere to be found. Local search and rescue teams combed the area for days. They brought in helicopters, tracking dogs, even thermal imaging equipment. The forest around Whispering Pines wasn't particularly dense or dangerous. There were no cliffs to fall from, no rivers to get swept away by. It was the kind of terrain where finding a missing person should have been straightforward. But Robert Chen had simply vanished without a trace. 2 weeks later, it happened again. Linda Martinez, a 68-year-old retired teacher from Arizona, had been staying at the park for almost a month. She was known around the campground for her morning walks and her friendly conversations with other guests. Linda had a routine of walking the park's perimeter road every day at 7 in the morning, a route that took her exactly 45 minutes to complete. On the day she disappeared, several other early risers saw her begin her usual walk. She waved to neighbors, stopped to pet a dog, and seemed in perfectly good spirits. But when her walking partner went to meet her at their usual rendezvous point, Linda never showed up. Her RV was found exactly as she'd left it. Coffee was still warm in the pot, her bed was made, and her purse sat on the counter with her phone plugged in to charge. It looked like she'd stepped out for just a few minutes and planned to return shortly. The search for Linda was even more intensive than the one for Robert. The park temporarily closed to new guests, while authorities scoured every inch of the property. They questioned every person who'd been staying there, reviewed security footage from the entrance gate, and even drained a small pond on the property just to be thorough. They found nothing. Linda Martinez had disappeared as completely as Robert Chen. Park management tried to downplay the incidents, suggesting that both missing persons had likely decided to leave unexpectedly and would turn up eventually. But word spread quickly through RV communities online, and reservations started getting canceled. Whispering Pines was facing a financial crisis when the third disappearance occurred. Thomas and Eileen Kowalski were a couple in their early 70s from Michigan. They'd been married for 48 years and traveled together constantly since retiring. Thomas was a former military police officer, trained to be observant and cautious. Eileen was a retired nurse who dealt with crisis situations her entire career. They weren't the type of people to panic or make poor decisions. The Kowalskis had heard about the previous disappearances, but decided to stay at Whispering Pines anyway, partly because they'd gotten a significant discount, and partly because Thomas was curious about what had really happened to the missing people. He spent his first few days at the park asking questions and observing the staff, looking for anything that seemed suspicious. What Thomas discovered was that both previous disappearances had occurred on days when certain staff members were working. A maintenance worker named Dale, who also happened to be the nephew of the park owner, had been on duty both times. Thomas also noticed that several long-term residents of the park seemed unusually nervous when discussing the missing people, changing the subject quickly or making excuses to end conversations. On their fourth night at the park, Thomas decided to do some investigating on his own. He told Eileen he was going for a late-night walk to check the security of the perimeter, something that was typical behavior for him given his military background. He took his phone, a flashlight, and a small notebook where he'd been recording his observations about the park's operations. Thomas never returned from that walk. When Eileen woke up the next morning and found him missing, she immediately called the police rather than reporting it to park management first. She'd been married to a cop long enough to know that the first 24 hours were crucial in missing person cases. But even with Eileen's quick thinking and law enforcement's immediate response, they found no trace of Thomas. His flashlight was discovered near the park's maintenance shed, but there were no signs of a struggle, no footprints leading away from the area, nothing to indicate what had happened to him. The investigation that followed was the most thorough yet. FBI agents interviewed every person who'd been at the park during any of the disappearances, looking for connections and patterns. They discovered that all 3 missing people had been staying in sites located in the same section of the park, an area that bordered the maintenance facilities. They also found something else that sent chills through the investigative team. Hidden in the woods behind the maintenance shed was a small clearing that showed signs of recent activity. The ground had been disturbed, and there were tire tracks from some kind of heavy vehicle. Most disturbing of all, they found personal items that belonged to all 3 missing people buried in shallow holes around the clearing. Robert Chen's wallet, Linda Martinez's wedding ring, and Thomas Kowalski's military dog tags were all recovered from the site. But the people themselves were still missing, and the items had been buried in a pattern that suggested ritual behavior rather than random disposal. Dale, the maintenance worker, was arrested and questioned extensively, but he maintained his innocence and had alibis for at least 2 of the disappearances. The park owner, his uncle, was also investigated but ultimately cleared of any wrongdoing. The case remains open, but authorities have no viable suspects and no leads about what happened to the 3 missing people. Whispering Pines RV Resort closed permanently 3 months ago. The property sits abandoned now, with no trespassing signs posted around the perimeter and police tape still fluttering from trees around the maintenance area. Local real estate agents say the property is unsellable given its history. But the most disturbing part of this story isn't what the authorities found. It's what they didn't find. Despite extensive searches involving multiple agencies and specialized equipment, no human remains were ever discovered anywhere on the property or in the surrounding wilderness. 3 people had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind only their personal belongings buried in a pattern that no one could explain. Eileen Kowalski still lives in Michigan, but she's never stopped searching for answers about what happened to her husband. She's hired private investigators, consulted with psychics, and even returned to Oregon multiple times to conduct her own searches of the area. When I spoke with her last month, she told me something that made my blood run cold. She said that in the weeks following Thomas's disappearance, she received several phone calls in the middle of the night. The caller never spoke, but she could hear breathing on the other end of the line. And in the background, she could swear she heard Thomas's voice calling her name. The calls stopped after she changed her phone number, but Eileen believes that somewhere out there, her husband is still alive and trying to reach her. These 3 stories might seem unrelated at first glance, but when you dig deeper, disturbing patterns start to emerge. I've spent months researching similar incidents across the country, and what I've discovered suggests these aren't isolated events. There's something much larger happening in the RV community that most people don't want to talk about. After the Whispering Pines investigation made national news, I started receiving messages from other RV travelers who'd had their own unsettling experiences. A retired couple from Florida told me about a park in New Mexico where they were photographed constantly by other guests who claimed to be documenting their RV journey for social media. A family from Texas described a park in Colorado where the management seemed to know intimate details about their personal lives before they'd even checked in. The more stories I collected, the clearer it became that certain RV parks operate differently than others. They're not just businesses providing camping spaces. They're something else entirely, and the people running them have agendas that go far beyond making money from overnight stays. I decided to visit some of these places myself, always traveling with others and never staying longer than a single night. What I found was a network of parks that seemed to communicate with each other, sharing information about guests in ways that would make most people extremely uncomfortable. At one park in Nevada, the manager casually mentioned details about my previous stays at other locations, places I'd never told him about. The staff at these parks ask questions that seem innocent on the surface but are actually designed to gather intelligence about travelers' habits, schedules, and personal circumstances. They want to know if you're traveling alone, how long you plan to stay in the area, whether you have family expecting to hear from you regularly. They frame these questions as friendly conversation or necessary paperwork, but the pattern becomes obvious once you know what to look for. Even more disturbing is how these parks seem to attract certain types of long-term residents. Not the typical retirees enjoying their golden years, but people who watch newcomers with unusual intensity and seem to have no actual travel plans despite living in RVs. They've created permanent communities within parks that are supposed to cater to temporary visitors, and they don't welcome outsiders. I've documented at least 15 parks across 8 states that exhibit these characteristics, and I suspect there are many more. They're not advertised on the usual travel websites, and you won't find them recommended in RV magazines. Instead, they rely on word-of-mouth referrals from people who are already part of whatever system they're operating. The victims in these stories all shared certain characteristics that made them attractive targets. They were traveling alone or in small groups. They had valuable RVs and equipment, and they were the type of people who might not be missed immediately if they disappeared. Robert Chen was a widower whose adult children lived overseas. Linda Martinez was divorced with no close family nearby. Even the Torres and Hendricks families were traveling far from home with no firm schedules that would raise alarms if they went missing. Law enforcement agencies are slowly starting to recognize that something organized is happening, but jurisdictional issues make it difficult to investigate crimes that cross state lines. The FBI has opened a task force specifically focused on missing persons cases related to RV travel, but they're working with limited resources and a lot of skepticism from local authorities who don't want to believe that rural camping areas could be centers of criminal activity. These 3 stories represent just the beginning of what I believe is a much larger and more sinister network operating within the RV community. If you're planning to hit the road in your own motorhome, do your research, trust your instincts, and never ignore that feeling when something doesn't seem right. The open road isn't always as safe as it appears, and sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones hiding in plain sight at your next campground.